It says it's being live streamed here,
Okay, it worked that time. Looks good.
but but I did not check on YouTube yet.
I think it's working. Yeah, it should be working.
Right. Ah, yes.
Okay, hello everyone. Uh, Thank you for joining us for today's fine seminar. Um, my name is Lauren Hayes, and I'm at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and I'm happy to um, host today's fine seminar, which is actually going to be a panel discussion. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly open up with an introduction and then turn it over to the other panelists. Basically, today the idea is to have a discussion about a framework that Peter Kappeler, a German scientist, proposed in 2019, and actually earlier in 2002, there was an earlier iteration, but most recently in behavioral ecology and sociobiology, Kappeler outlined a framework that included um, multiple components of the social system, animal social systems. And so today, the panel is going to discuss that actual framework. And so we're joined by myself, Carsten Schroden, Linda Lani Makue, Isabella Capellini, and, and Michael Taborski. And so the objective is quite simple, just to generate some discussion about the positive impacts and usefulness of the framework, as well as the limitations for understanding animal social systems. And so hopefully that discussion will generate some interesting perspectives on how Kapler's framework has shaped the field. So just a brief panel introduction. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction to start, hopefully just a couple of minutes. And then I'll turn it over to Karsten, who's going to talk about the impact of the framework from his perspective. And then following Karsten, Lindalani Makui will discuss, I think, potentially the impact of the framework on understanding solitary organisms. And then Isabella Capellini will talk about Kapler's framework in the context of parental care. And then we'll round it out with Michael Toporski providing some discussion about the framework and potentially how it relates to social complexity and other issues. And then hopefully that will lead to some interesting discussion at the end. We look to hear from people about their thoughts on the framework and also how other ways it can be applied. And so very briefly, one of the paper, as you see, was published in 2019. One of the big things that came out of it was that Kapler described a social system or a society as having four interrelated but independent components. You had social organization, which describes who lives with who. And so that reflects the number of individuals, the adult sex composition, kin composition of social units. And from that, you can have solitary, pair living, or group living of various forms. Social structure just sort of describes social interactions within the social unit and how those are non-sexual, non-care interactions, and also forms of communication. The mating system describes who mates with who and who reproduces, and the care system is who cares for the offspring. And again, these are considered four different components in that they can have different forms of selection acting or just have different levels of selection. And yet they're interrelated because if one component's impacted or changes, it can affect the others. And so from our perspective, at least my perspective, the advantages of this framework is, I think, first in its simplicity, has clear terminology and definitions, something I think we've struggled with in the field. And with that, I think it can enhance the quality of quantitative comparative studies, where if we have clearer definitions, different taxa that are described in different ways, we can come together with one framework so we can do those comparisons. It does move beyond simple species-specific classifications. So you don't have potentially, in this discussion, I'm sure that will come up, social monogamy, for example. You can think about how an organism may live as a pair and have monogamous or other types of sexual relationships. And as Peter argued in the paper, it ends the arbitrary use of the term social. And so from this, one of the advantages, I think Carsten or someone else will speak more in depth about this, is that you can have many different potential types of social systems, allows for greater understanding of not only interspecific variation, but also variation within species. So if you have a species that historically has been referred to as group living, we now can think of it as how variable is their social organization? Are some units solitary? Are some units paired? Are some units multi-male, multi-female groups? And then think about how that might impact other components of the social system. Now, the framework is by far not perfect, of course, and there are some limitations. And I think from my perspective, one of the biggest limitations is we still struggle with the definition of social structure. Um, it's I think that's one of the more complex components, and we still need to, I think, have some discussions and come to agreement what that means. And so with that, the panel will dive more into those issues and other related issues. But I wanted to highlight that this panel also is an aim is to sort of help us to inform the fine community and grow and interest potentially in a special a topical collection that Karsten and I are co-editing for behavioral ecology and social biology. And we already have a number of papers that we established ahead of time that are contributions. So there's an introductory paper already by Carson and I that's online. And then we're going to be receiving papers from various folks dealing with the different components. So Steve Dobson will lead a paper on mating systems in terms of social structure. Adriana Maldonado Chaparro has that. We'll be discussing that very complex issue. And Isabella Capellini, who you'll hear from today, will be discussing the care system and how it relates to Kappeler. And then we have other papers that have sort of more broader applications. Linda Lani Makue will be leading a paper on solitary organisms, solitary species. Amanda Ridley, who gave a talk in Fine several years ago, will talk about social systems in a hot world. Claudia Fitchell will write a paper on cognition. Julia Ostner and Oliver Schulke are going to lead a paper on primate social systems. My colleague in Chile, Luis Edmondsberger, will lead a paper on social instability. And then we have two papers on eusociality in mammals that we anticipate, one by Sabine Beckel and one by Marcus Zoltel. And then we're particularly excited to have a paper on insects. Kappeler's framework originally was for mammals, particularly primates, and we have Raga Havendra Gadikar writing a paper on how it relates to social insects. And then at the last major contribution set up ahead of time was by two contributions are Michael Taborski and Dustin Rubenstein, where we're writing, thinking about, I think, other comparisons, other frameworks, so giving a more critical viewpoint on, and you'll hear some of Michael's thoughts on that topic today. And then we hope that we're going to have a concluding remarks paper, more of a personal view by Carol Van Schenk and Peter Kappeler, the original authors on the original paper in 2002. And if you're interested in contributing, the submission deadline is the 1st of September. We will consider papers that are reviews, comparative, species-specific empirical studies. We prefer shorter papers. So the philosophy on that is that most of us are likely to read short papers and cite them. And the main requirement we have is that you address your system or review has to address Kappeler's framework and make it very clear. Carsten and I will be handling editors on papers with no conflicts of interest. And I believe Theo Bacher, the associate editor who welcomed our contribution, will be handling papers for which Carsten and I have a conflict. And so we hope that people get excited about this and contribute. And I will now turn it over to Carsten as we basically go into the discussion. And thanks for the panel, everyone on the panel, for everyone for being here.
Yes, thank you, Lauren. So, I have to put this away. Too many screens. I told everyone to be short, but unfortunately, I made too many slides. So the slides I will be showing, I will not go into all the details of the graphs in there to keep it short. I can already tell you my three main points. The first one is for me the big advantage of the framework is clear definitions that we know what we are working on and we can tell it to each other and communicate it well. The second point is that of the four components, social structure is by far the most complex and diverse one, which might cover as much variation like all the other three components together. And the third one, but Michael will talk better about it, is that the problem of what is social complexity and can we really measure it. But for me, the main point why I thought it's a good idea to have this topic of collection is the definition so that we really know what we are studying and communicate it well. So the framework of Peter Kappeler, and this is how he published it in the 2019 paper, is powerful before it clearly defines the different components and aspects of this component. And my aim of this topical collection and this meeting today is that everybody defines what aspects of social system is studied, preferably using the framework from Kappeler. If not the framework from Kappeler, then another framework or other definitions, but at least to always make clear what is it that you are really working on. So examples of problems is that I experience, especially as somebody who works on institute focusing on ecophysiology, not behavioral ecology, is everybody somehow wants to include sociality in his or her studies without really knowing what it is. And I reviewed many papers where people talk about sociality, and I needed a lot of time to find out what it is that they're really studying. We created a database over nearly 10 years on mammalian social systems, social organization, and many people approach me and ask, can we have this database because want to have sociality as a core factor in our study? And I realize they don't even know what it is that they want, and often they don't want what we have, but more something social structure or mixture of different stuff. And I think it's important to come to clear definitions what it is that we are really studying. Um, Another recent comment we got from a paper that then got rejected at tree is that where we argue that solitary living species, that social organization often have non-random interactions with neighbors, which is social structure, and then the referee said, yeah, but then they're not solitary living. And for me, this is clearly the benefit of this framework to see what is the composition of social units, the social organization, solitary, and how do they interact. That is another aspect of the social system. Or another paper we had on elephant shoes where we wanted to study comparatively the evolution of social organization of pair living and its variation. And one referee was really not happy with it, but wanted to have that we study social monogamy, whatever this is. And social monogamy for me and for many people is a problem in our field, and I wonder where this comes from. And I don't wonder, I have a very strong opinion, which you might not like. Social monogamy always seems to include pair living, which is social organization, in or not in combination with any of the following, like monogamy as a mating system where only one male and one female mate with each other, exclusive matings. Often it should include pair bonds, which to my knowledge experimentally has only been shown in different species of microtus and in titty monkeys. In all other species, just kind of assumed because you see that there are social bonds, but if these are pair bonds defined that they prefer their partner over someone else has experimentally been shown in a handful of species, so you cannot really study it comparatively. Then often it's assumed to include biparental care, so maternal and paternal care, but sometimes this is excluded because then you don't have enough species to study it. And it excludes pair social monogamy, excludes when we observe the social organization of pair living in species that are not typically regarded to be socially monogamous from our feeling. And I think with this, we miss some variation that has been observed and described in natural populations. It also ignores that social bonds are quite common in non-pair living species, and especially considering that many of these pair living species might have social bonds, but not pair bonds in the definition that are stronger than there's a stronger attraction than to others. This is problematic. With this, we ignore all these important social bonds in species that are not living in a social organization of pairs. The same for paternal care, which occurs not so rarely in species that are not living in pairs, but people just ignore it. And where does this come from? From my perspective, I think this comes because social monogamy is the hallmark of Western society based on Christianity, where we have this nice feeling there should be a woman and a male that are bonded with each other and take care of the offspring together. This perfect way that we humans should be, which some people believe, and that's the hallmark of society. And thus, we should also study this in the animal kingdom. But I do not think that this cultural background should define how we define animal social systems or should approach it. For me, I always teach, and maybe I'm wrong, or maybe it could be done better. Animal behavior is based on description of the patterns of what we observe in nature and then explain it by the four questions of Tinbergen and its function, phylogeny, ontogeny, and mechanisms. And this description here should be the basis and not be based on what we expect is the most important thing, a combination of social organization living in a pair, social structure being pair bonded, and monogamous, only these two matings with each other, and the last care system of biparental care. And so this needs a framework to start with to describe what we really study and clear definitions. And I think this is what has been provided by the framework of Peter Kappeler. So clear definitions have for me the advantage that everybody knows what we are talking about. Some people describe the composition of social units as social organizations, other as social structure. But if you at least define it at the very beginning of your study or paper, everybody knows what it is you're dealing with. Without a proper description and definition, I do not think that animal behavior can be explained. When you're already wrong here or you're not clear here, how do you want to explain what you observe after the four questions of Tinbergen? Important from my point of view, because there has been some confusion. Kappeler's framework describes the social system. It is here on this level. It's not an explanation. And therefore, also, it does not need a theory underlying it because the theory comes in here at the four questions of Tinbergen. So this here is how Peter Kappeler described it in his 2019 paper. You see it is getting quite complex. And what I want to point out is that the way Lauren and I use in our comparative studies is a simplified version of his model. Like for the social organization, we mainly look at the composition of social units, and we don't look at kinship, which he says is part of it, or the spatio-temporal variation. But this is a way we use it to simplify it. And I think how to use the framework, if you describe what you study, depends on your research question, and it can be used in different ways. For example, Filippo Aureli and co-workers, the last author, by the way, Karel van Schaik, who was also the second author on the original paper on the framework, they looked at fission fusion dynamics, which is also part of social organization. Social organization here, Lauren and I, we focus on group size, group composition, and these aspects, while they here looked at spatial variation, temporal variation, and adult sex ratio, and developed a three-dimensional model how to describe these fission fusion dynamics in vertebrate societies, coming to a measure that could then be used in comparative studies. Also, in our introductory paper that is published, there's a very difficult figure. You can have a look there. I won't go there in detail, but I tried to use the framework of Peter Kappeler in my teaching to show students how the social system that consists of the four components in striped mice changes throughout the year through different seasons, breeding season, non-breeding season, pre-breeding season, and in different years, and the different four components of it. And for me, that was interesting to see that actually the social organization in my study species is the most flexible one that depends most on the environment, while the social structure, how they interact, is always quite similar. And also important to see that the mating system for most of the year doesn't play any role. In primates, it might be quite different, where the mating system is always part of the social system. But for most mammals, that might not be the case. And as to reach reproductive success and contribute to the next generations, you have to survive these periods of non-reproduction. Shows that the mating system is maybe not as important as many people believe that mainly live with primates. In other words, a striped mouse that survives the 9 months without mating system being present and reproduces has a higher reproductive success than the average already because most of them die before reaching the breeding season. Then there's the problem. I don't know if it's a problem of social structure, but the social organization, care system, mating system can be put into easy categories. But social structure, if it concludes all the social interactions, has many, many different aspects like pair bonds. Do they occur? Yes or no? But this should be measured on a continuous way. Also, dominance hierarchies continuously, territoriality, cooperation, and this within groups, and from my opinion, also between groups. So I think the social structure itself has as much complexity or variation like the three other systems together. And the last, I don't know if it's 10 years or longer, the study of using social networks has flourished and dominated because finally, with this statistical tool, one could approach some aspects of the social structure one could not approach before. But it does not cover all of it, and some of this is missing in this new approach, and we might need new approaches to also address these other aspects of social structure. Then finally, and this is just one comment of mine, but maybe Michael has a much better point on this, is about his paper was actually the 2001 2019 called a framework for studying social complexity. And when you see how much there is in social systems and how much there can differ between species in a continuous or categorical way, it is obviously very complex. But in this paper, I didn't see a way that he describes how we could put a measure on this complexity. And I have read many papers that claim my species is highly complex, has a high social complexity, but I do not remember any paper that describes how to quantify this really in a proper way that everybody could agree on. These definitions often do not exist or they are more complex than itself. And I myself, I don't like the term social complexity at all because I do not know what it is, but maybe that's simply because I'm too stupid. But I think it would be, I think we still don't have a good framework to put a number on social complexity. So to summarize, my personal recommendations is use Kappeler's framework to study different aspects of social systems. If not, then use another framework and not just common terms like sociality, social structure without defining it. Define what you are studying. So in every case, define the terms you are using. And I personally, unless you have a good definition, would recommend to avoid the term social complexity and do not try to explain its evolution unless you can really put a number on it and define it and make it quantifiable. And with this, I'm finished. Thank you for listening to me, and then I will hand over to Lindelani Makuya to show how solitary species can differ in their social system in other aspects than the social organization.
Okay, thank you, Carsten, for that. So the way I will start is just by trying to understand how solitary living comes about and has these different forms of social systems. And the first question to address with this is why study solitary living? And the main reason for this is that if we do not understand solitary living, then we cannot understand its alternatives, which is usually pair and group living. So for now, we have tried to develop a scientific community where we are studying not only solitary living, but also its ecology and evolution and also the mechanisms that surround it. Just want to move this away. And the main reason is that there's a huge fundamental problem in social evolution where there's this misconception that solitary living needs no explanation. And this has been for many decades where evolutionary biologists and behavioral ecologists have studied why animals live in groups, but so far neglecting the alternative of why many species live solitarily. So we believe that now is really a very good time to study solitary living as a biological trait, and exploring all these different types of topics, for ranging from the mechanisms of solitary living, the behavioral mechanisms like aggression, avoidance, and also absence of social attraction, the neuroendocrine mechanisms, as well as the ecology of solitary living. So I won't go into details to bore you with this diagram, which you've seen many times. But what I want to focus mostly on is that on the social organization and on the component of solitary living, where solitary living is just one component of different social systems, which I will explain in a minute. So if we take the European hamster as a prime example of a solitary species, we can see that its social organization is that of solitary living. It is defined as an animal which is very territorial with its social structure, and it shows maternal care, and it has a polyandrous mating system. And this is just one component of the social system that you can see, that you can find from a solitary species. And the way we have so far defined solitary living is that we define it based on the social organization of the social unit. So we look at both the adult male and the adult females and the percentage of time that they spend. So if it's less than 50% of the time, then we say that these individuals are solitary living. Of course, we realize that we may need to revisit our definition, which is something I'm hoping to be able to address in the paper, because we see that there is a bit of a gap, and maybe we can also have a discussion about this at the end. But in general, solitary living is a successful adaptation for many different taxa. So example, if we take some examples of solitary species and looking at their parental, or we're looking at their care system, we see, like, for example, in a solitary bee that shows some maternal care, the Siamese fighting fish, which shows parental care, the common toad and the red-footed tortoises, which show no care, the bird, the southern cassowary, which shows paternal care, and also the Middle Eastern mowat, which has been shown to show no care at all. And even though all of these species are defined as being solitary living, but by just looking at their care system, we see that we then get a whole different range in the spectrum of solitary living. And Isabella will, of course, talk more about the parental care system. But solitary living is also a successful adaptation to many environments. Harsh environments are said to favor the evolution of complex societies, with the arising in cooperative breeding. For example, in the Kalahari semi-desert, 6 out of the 90 mammal species listed in the Anderson book were listed as being cooperative breeders, while 30 species are solitary living. So even in this environment, there were many social but even more solitary species that are adapted to it. And where does this success actually come from? Well, the main cost of solitary living arises from missing out on the benefits of group living. And help by kin can also increase direct fitness, and also helping kin can also increase the inclusive fitness of those individuals. But in general, what is important, or what has been important for me so far, is to see that for solitary individuals, if we're looking at their social organization, they have these non-random individualized social relationships, which is their social structure. And here we can therefore see that solitary living does not necessarily imply being asocial. So some of the mechanisms that could bring about solitary living is this different behavioral and physiological mechanisms that could underline the different forms of solitary living, from a highly aggressive species such as the European hamster, where they are solitary living because they actively avoid each other due to this aggression that they have, as opposed to the bush rat, which is more solitary living, probably due to a lack of bonding, and this leading to then avoidance of individuals. So here, solitary living is just a part of 2 or maybe even more different social system. So we see that from this more than 1,000 different social systems, from solitary living can just be just one component of it. Where if you look at the social organization, we can see solitary living with individuals having this kin-based spatial structure. Their social structure could have non-random interactions, or they can be very tolerant to highly aggressive. Of course, mating system of different possibilities are possible. And with the care system, with some individuals having no care, some having maternal care, and some showing parental care. And just to summarize, the main points that I will try and address for my section is that looking at solitary living is just a successful adaptation to the many different environments that individuals are found in. Solitary species often have this kin-based spatial structure, and I will be bringing some examples for that. And solitary individuals, when you look at the social organizations, have this non-random, individualized social relationships, which is characteristic of their social structure. And it is just one component of different social systems with the different behavioral as well as physiological mechanisms that might underlie the different forms of solitary living, which we can see from this highly aggressive species, such as the European hamsters, to this very tolerant species. And studying solitary living as an evolved trait can be very important to understand some aspects of social evolution. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Linda Lani. And next we have Isabella.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm sharing this one. Yeah. Okay. Do you see the slide?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Okay, so what I will cover is a little bit of an overview of particularly comparative studies, because the framework is particularly helpful to try and understand diversity at large scale, so across species. Okay, so as have been mentioned, definitions are important. So here I'm using definition of parental care, most frequently is used in the field of parental care research of any parental behavior, but also adaptation like viviparity, that increases the fitness of the offspring and typically comes at some cost to the carer, and is generally applied to post-fertilization behaviors and adaptations. And I want to put a little bit of caveat here: at some cost to the carer. Doesn't always happen. For example, in fish, parental care by males can in fact increase male attractiveness for females, and females come and lay eggs in nest of fish, male fish that have already clutches and they're already guarding clutches. And is generally, as I said, consider parental behavior to be parental care if it is post-fertilization, excluding behaviors like nest building prior to fertilization that are more common, for example, in crustaceans. And this is because this behavior tend to be relatively short in their duration, and the eggs or fry are left on their own soon after being laid. So this is the system that you have already seen. Parental care here in Peter Kappeler's framework is defined considering the identity of individuals that are involved in the care. So we have no care, maternal, paternal, biparental, or care by helpers in relation to the kinship to the offspring. The reason why parental care has been highly researched is because it has profound consequences for animal life and is related to a variety of aspects of a social system. And here, Trivers have spurred interest in the consequences of increased parental investment for the fitness of both the offspring and the parents through his theoretical work. And as I've been just reminded, he died very recently. But the empirical work is set off as increased interest in parental care in empirical studies, in comparative studies, as well as in bringing forward theoretical studies. For example, in the field of life history evolution, the evolution of parental care is expected to lead to a series of trade-offs. For example, increase in parental care leads to larger eggs, but fewer eggs or fewer offspring because the resources that a mother has are finite. And in the field of social evolution, both theoretical and empirical studies have focused on the interaction between individuals once parental care evolves in relation to cooperation and conflict between family members. So sexual conflict, so how much care each parent provides, parent-offspring conflict, at what point the parents wants to stop and providing care, and while the offspring are interested in receiving more care, and sibling competition to receive more share of the care provided by the parents. But in more recent studies in comparative analysis, some really interesting patterns are starting to emerge at the point where we start integrating parental care with other aspects of the social system. For example, a relatively recent paper in reptiles found that viviparity is a stepping stone for the evolution of family ties, defined as an association prolonged for beyond action between parents and offspring. And so it's a sort of stepping stone towards more complex social system. And then family living, defined as parental care and association between parents and offspring beyond nutritional independence, has been found to be a stepping stone for the evolution of cooperative breeding in birds. So parental care is central to creating this additional aspect of a social system, facilitating evolution, additional aspect of a social system. With regard to mating system, parental care has been found to follow the evolution of social monogamy in mammals. So there are two theoretical opposing ideas. One was that male care facilitates the evolution of social monogamy, or the opposite, that male care only once they have increased certainty of paternity. And the latter has to be found to be the case for mammals in a paper in Science 2013. But is also related to the flexibility of care provided. For example, males across birds, mammals, fish, and insects, males adjust the level of parental contribution when care is costly and when there is high risk of cuckoldry. So in this condition, they decrease the level of care they provide. But one aspect I want to put the emphasis on is that all of these papers, even with the recent advances in the relationship between parental care and various autonomic systems and mating systems, tend to consider parental care, particularly in relation to the identity of individuals. But if we look at parental care, there is a much greater diversity than that. We have when the care is provided, at what stage of offspring development. Is it the egg stage? Is it the larval stage or a juvenile stage? There is also the integration of this stage that leads to the duration of parental care. Is it limited to one stage, or is it prolonged to more stages? And then there is also the big issue of the diversity of care forms in terms of the behavior that animals provide. So to give you an example, for amphibians, we have attendance that can happen at the age of the egg, or at the stage of a tadpole, or at the juvenile. We can have transport of tadpoles or juveniles. We can have feeding through trophic eggs, or through skin, live skin in the caecilians. We can have brooding, which happens here in this picture. I put brooding underneath the skin, but can happen in the stomach or also in the vocal sacs. And then there is viviparity that can end with the emergence of tadpoles or juveniles. So all of this diversity is generally ignored But if we look at this behavior and we look at this adaptation, we can expect that they are quite different in the constant benefit they provide to both the parents and the offspring. And that, I think, is the reason why we should think about this diversity when we look at the evolution of parental care, but also the consequences of parental care for life history and social system. And when we do that, then we start seeing things that we didn't expect. For example, in mammals, we found that the presence of male care can increase parental fitness through higher fecundity of females, so larger litters and more frequent breeding, but only when we have costly behavior like provisioning the mother and carrying the offspring, not when we have behaviors like grooming and huddling. And then if we look at amphibians, we find that uniparental care by either sex increases egg and tadpole survival, but the cost of caring are high with garden and city strategy, presumably because this reduces opportunities for feeding and increased predation risk. This is a paper, a review, a meta-analysis paper by Machado and Macedo-Rego. We can also look at diversity in relation to life history. And if we do that, what we found, for example, in amphibians is it's very complex. When we look just at the trade-offs between egg size and egg number, we have behaviors like egg attendance that are only associated with larger eggs, regardless of the sex, maternal or paternal. But we have behaviors or adaptation like egg brooding that do have increased egg size and reduced clutch size as expected. And then we have other behaviors like tadpole transport that only reduce clutch size but have no effect on egg size. And then we have behavior like tadpole feeding that reduce both clutch size and egg size, presumably because the mother continuously produced eggs that are used to feed the tadpoles. So we emerge, by considering diversity of parental care, a far more complex picture emerge in terms of how, in terms of what the theory predicts and also how parental care relates to our system. And we find there are evidences of this complexity being important, for example, in marine fish, where only brooding and viviparity consider the highest and more complex level of parental care form, but not simple egg attendance and nest building, are accompanied by larger hatchling size. We can also look at how parental care in itself evolved and how that relates to our forms. So if we look at parental care in amphibian, all of this diversity, we found that egg attendance is gained and lost far more easily than more complex form of care. And what we argue in this paper is that egg attendance is under control of the parents, while once we have care post-hatching, the tadpoles and the offspring have the opportunity to manipulate parental care through communication. We also find that egg attendance is a stepping stone for prolonged care and preceded the evolution of tadpole care and juvenile care. And we also look at biparental care. In amphibian, we found that even with division of labor, contrary to theory, biparental care is evolutionary unstable, is lost much more quickly than it is gained. So again, by incorporating diversity, we can look at how complexity in various forms have evolved and test theoretical models. So in conclusion, I argue that while Peter Kappeler's framework is very helpful in defining several aspects of the social system, it's a bit simplistic when it comes to the treatment of parental care. But we are at a point where we have huge amount of data, we have phylogenies, and we can start really using and exploiting this diversity, not only to understand how parental care in itself has evolved, but also how parental care relates to other aspects of a social system. And here in this context, Kappeler's framework is very helpful for the definition it provides and the structure it provides. And that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabella. Very interesting. And now, please, Michael Taborski.
Yes, hello. Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes, looks
Okay,
good.
great. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak a little bit about my views on this framework. I will focus a little bit on the limitations as I was asked to look into different concepts and also the limitations of the framework provided by Peter Kappeler for the studying of social complexity. Actually, I think that is important to keep in mind. And I will also discuss a little bit what Lauren Hayes and Carsten Schradin want to make of it, and also provide some comments on the introductory chapter that they have published in behavioral ecology and sociobiology. I would really like to make clear that what Kappeler wanted to do, as far as I understood, was to provide a framework for studying the evolution of social complexity. Whereas Lauren and Carsten try to propose, as far as I understand, uh, that the framework should be used to classify and categorize social systems to enable a comparative approach to social systems. So I think the major emphasis of these two papers is actually different. And I will, of course, mainly talk about the framework that Peter Kappeler has provided and try to outline some of the limitations that I see in the framework. So first, perhaps we should look into the objectives of this framework. Peter Kappeler really wants to understand which features of a social system contribute to social complexity. And as I already mentioned, Lauren and Carsten rather want to look into the framework as providing a comprehensive framework for studying animal social systems, not social complexity. And we heard already from Carsten that he doesn't find the idea of social complexity very constructive because it is very difficult to quantify and to measure objectively. So Lauren and Carsten really would like to use the framework to identify many, many different types of social systems. But let me first look into the definitions that Peter Kappeler is using for a social system and social complexity. Peter Kappeler says, I define and characterize social organization, social structure, mating system, and care system. We have seen this concept already as distinct components of a social system. Of social complexity involves that complex social systems are those in which individuals frequently interact in many different contexts with many different individuals and often repeatedly interact with many of the same individuals over time. And this is a definition that Peter has used from a publication of Friedberg and others in 2012, published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. So according to this definition of social complexity, I think we run into the problem that we must actually define the herd of wildebeest as complex because they interact repeatedly among each other with the same individuals and with different individuals in different contexts. They search food, they migrate, They may even get involved in mating in these herds and things like that. And the same is true for fish schools that also have interactions with the same and different individuals repeatedly over a prolonged period of time, and also in different functional contexts. They search for food, they avoid predators and things like that. And the same is true, for example, for a flock of starlings, which forms temporarily, but also has fulfills different functions. So I think this definition that Peter has used for uh, social complexity is ambiguous. It's a bit difficult to apply. There are alternative definitions of social complexity. For example, social complexity is based on the number of differentiated relationships that individuals have. This is more pointing towards what Peter Kappeler in his framework covers in the category social structure. This is a definition that was proposed by Bergman and Behner. And we have used social complexity describing group living that involves individual relationships between group members, depending, for instance, on their status, state, or relatedness. This is what I personally think is most important, that it's sort of individual relationships among members of social entities, whether it is a closed group or a transient association is a different question. So what I regard as complex social systems, for example, is social insects like ants, where even if it's not a completely individualized relationship between the members, they have different roles, they have different functions, they have different reproductive states, for example, and they base their social interactions on these differences, which leads to division of labor, to task specialization and things like that. I think this is really a very good example for a complex social system. Or if we think of cooperatively breeding fish, where you have a pair together with various other individuals in the group raising offspring together that are produced by the pair mainly, and interact with neighbors. They defend the territory jointly. They cooperate in digging out the shelter, in caring for the eggs and for the larvae and things like that. So I think, and actually, as our experiments also could show, their decisions to interact with one another strongly depend on what others are doing or have been doing. They punish, for example, lazy or idle helpers if they do not work as expected and things like that. And of course, social complexity is also involved in primate social systems, like in our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, where there is, of course, also a strong individualization of the relationships between group members. So Peter Kappeler in his paper complains that at the moment there is no single comprehensive measure of or index of animal social complexity that can be used for meaningful interspecific comparisons or rankings, and he's aiming to work towards this, and says to compare levels of social complexity across species will require a scale that ideally integrates measures of both group size and relationship diversity. And the question is there reason to believe that a quantitative measure of social complexity can ever be obtained, given all the different components that are so important in structuring a social system? We have already seen this one figure that Peter Kappeler in his paper in 2019 provided, and that there are these four different categories of a social system: social organization, social structure, the mating system, and the care system. And I only wanted to point out that there are also problems in the definition that one might use, for example, to explain what social structure or social organization is. If we look into the components that are part of social organization according to this framework, then the relatedness or kinship pattern, as it is called, could also be well part of the social structure, I think. Or if you look at dominance hierarchy, that is certainly in the view of many researchers part of the social organization. So I think it is difficult to separate some of these categories. And also mating and care system functionally have many relationships, and to separate them from each other is a bit arbitrary in my view. So Kappeler himself has realized the problem of clearly defining all these different components. And he says social behavior, social structure, organization, system, roles, social strategies, and several other similar terms have been and are being used to refer to both the same and very different aspects of sociality. The two main components of social complexity, in his view, which are group size and composition, as well as the patterns of social relationships, have both been referred to as social organization and social structure. And these terms are even used synonymously in the same paper. So this is something that he has realized, and he would like to solve that problem by his classification. But my question is whether this is really likely to change. I think this may be a bit overambitious, that the concept will sort of end this confusion of different terms if they are not clearly defined, as Carsten has outlined, as a precondition that each paper should initially clarify the terms that they are using. So there are potential problems, I think, of the classification of this framework, which mainly mean that different components of social systems can be shaped by different selection pressures, and these are not included because it is a descriptive framework. And there may be substantial intraspecific variation in components of social systems. So even within species, it may be difficult to clearly describe a system with all the different components that the framework outlines. So my conclusion is that a descriptive categorization of sociality, as the framework of Peter Kappeler provides, may on the one hand help guiding ideas and also developing concepts, and it can certainly point out gaps and misconceptions, but it will not yield a metric for quantitative interspecific comparisons, in my view. And it cannot replace explanatory frameworks based on evolutionary models of underlying selection mechanisms. So I think these are the things that I think are worth being discussed. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Michael. And that's really excellent, very interesting. And I think that we're going to generate some great discussion. And I want to thank the panel again for preparing slides and doing this and putting together really interesting presentations. In particular, I want to shout out to Isabella because she came in late because a little bit unorganized on my end. So thanks to Isabella. And I really appreciate Michael's position and standing up for contradictory viewpoints from the majority. So I think this is going to be a fantastic discussion both here and I hope in behavioral ecology, sociobiology. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and I want to ask people, please chime in with your questions. You can ask direct questions of the panelists, or if you have comments, things that you want to be considered, please do. If you have a comment or question, please put a question in the chat. And as always, we try to prioritize students, postdocs first. So if you're a student or postdoc, put a S or a P after your question mark. And if you're on YouTube, Adriana will relay the questions directly to me. So I'm going to go first with Sari and then Karsten. So Sari, please go.
Hi everyone, my name is Sari Van Bada. I work with black howler monkeys in Mexico. When I was invited to the Fine Talk to give my own talk, I started, I believe, with this framework in my talk, and I mentioned that the intergroup relationships that animals have is not so well represented in that framework, although it seems to be part of the social structure, or it's kind of in there. It's like quickly, like as a passing, it's like, oh, that's also part of the social structure. But it seems like, and I like the presentation of Isabella in that really deconstructing kind of the care system, in that there are so many aspects to that. And I believe that the social structure should be subdivided into intra-group and intergroup, and that should be made very clear from the get-go. And obviously there will be kind of a blurry line. It's not that strict of a black and white, but still I think that that is an important distinction to make. Like in the paper that you wrote, Lauren, together with Karsten, about this, so using the framework for the social system, you have kind of sentences that explains that intergroup is part of the social structure, but then in the framework, the simplified framework as you presented, it's just presented as being territorial, as if that is just the component of being of how intergroup relationships work, while obviously it's much more complex to that. So I think that in the entire topical collection, a paper on intergroup relationships should be part of that kind of kind of that system.
Great, thank you. So the next, I'm going to go to Karsten next.
Yes, thank you. I think one point that Sari made, which if I understood it right, is very important, that there can be complexity in all the four different components and subcomponents of Kappeler's framework. And some species might be have a lot of complexity in the social structures, other in the diversity of care system. And so that's why it's so difficult to come to a common measure of complexity. But I mainly wanted to comment on Michael's talk and I have a question. First, he identified very well, which I also identified with preparing this, that there's actually two different papers from Peter, the original paper from 2002 on the social systems, on which our work is based and which we started in 2015, so before the 2019 paper came out. And I have to admit, we never read the 2019 paper as a paper to study social complexity, which I know I won't be able to do, but just to see the fourth component of care system added to it. So these are, like Michael said, two different things. And if now we now always talk about the 2019 paper, it's the 2002 paper, Kappeler and Van Schaik, where the description of the social systems came from. So, Michael, I wanted to ask you, can you give us, at the end, you said it doesn't replace explanatory frameworks based on evolutionary theory. Can you give us a short example, one of those frameworks, and whether these frameworks can be used without having a descriptive framework before to define clearly what component or part of a social system is studied?
Yeah, I think it would be overambitious to come up with a framework that is based on evolutionary models that are looking into underlying selection mechanisms to understand the whole variety of social systems or social patterns. But I think Therefore, I'm a bit skeptical about such sort of overarching frameworks because I'm not sure whether they can really help us to understand underlying evolutionary selection mechanisms. And I think rather one should look into the details of phenomena that need to be explained. For example, cooperative brood care between parents and non-parents. That is something where there is a lot of formal models that can explain why and under which conditions and in which contexts such systems may evolve. So I think to focus on a sort of combination between theoretical modeling and then looking into particular systems and empirical results, how evolutionary models can explain certain traits that apparently have evolved by natural selection are more productive in a way than just a descriptive framework like the one we're discussing.
Yeah, I think you need both. Otherwise, it's not possible. I mean, Ben Mocha, who gave a file, he showed nicely for his co-breed database how important it is to describe the cooperative breeding observed in a proper continuous way instead of just categorizing yes or no, but then to use evolution to explain this variation.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly, it's necessary to have a look also on the variation between different systems and try to identify the components by which they differ. I fully agree with that. And I'm not saying that such descriptive framework is useless. Don't misunderstand me. I just say that it is it has limited possibilities to explain things. And that is actually something, Carsten, that you have also mentioned in your presentation today, that this is not an explanatory framework, it's a descriptive framework. And we should not be too overambitious to try to understand evolutionary principles that underlie the variation that we observe in all these different components that are part of this framework.
Great. Carson, are you interested in responding, or should I move on to the next
No, I
question?
mean, I agree. Yes, of course. Like I said,
Okay,
it's not theory based, the framework, it's describing, and then theory comes afterwards.
great. I'm going to move on to Sandra, please.
Hello, thank you, Lauren, and thank you, everybody. My name is Sandra Smith. I'm at the National Autonomous University in Mexico, and I study spider monkeys. And I was wondering, well, to me, well, thank you, everybody, for their great presentations. This has been really, really nice. And to me, the 2019 paper has been helpful. And I mean, like the way, or he recaps on his previous classification of social systems is helpful to think about aspects of social systems which may contribute in different ways to this social complexity thing. And for me, it's been helpful when thinking of social complexity to think about, or the proposal of several people of thinking about social uncertainty and how all these different components, which might or may not always be so clearly distinguished, as a couple of you have mentioned, no, can set different scenarios in terms of how uncertain an individual will be regarding the social context or the socio-ecological context even that they will face and that they have to deal with, no? And I think there are a couple of, at least I can think of two measures that have been proposed to try to deal or quantify that uncertainty. But and they might or may not be useful. I don't want to discuss that, but I was just wondering if anybody, what your thoughts are on this idea of social uncertainty as a way to approach social complexity. So it might go off track a little bit, but if you have any thoughts on that, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Anyone on the panel wish to respond or?
I was a bit distracted by the postman, but from what I got, the point of Sandra is that most of these measures of social systems are actually should be in the ideal world continuous measures. There's not something that is just categorical, like social stability, like animals that live in groups of 6 individuals. There can be huge variations even in the group cohesions, like the fission fusion dynamics and so on. So most of these measures are something continuous, if I did not misunderstand that. This adds endless complexity and variation to all the animal social systems we observe.
Yeah, I guess in a way that each of these components can I mean, make up the social system or the social scenario that any given individual will face at any given time, and they have to deal with it. So to me, the idea of social uncertainty and quantifying that, I mean, it will be influenced by all the components probably, or some more or some others less. But I guess that's, to me, been helpful when thinking about social complexity, and why to me it made sense in Kappeler's paper that he looked at the different components to try to think of complexity. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. So I'm gonna go to Filippo first, and then I'll go to Perfect, who's a student. So Filippo, please go ahead, and then Perfect, you're next in the queue.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot for the panel discussion. Very nice, very good. And I'm a big fan of Kappeler's work. As Carsten mentioned, I've been using the 2002 since it was there, and then updating with the 2019. But I'm very fond of the 2002. On these three elements that were there, of course, the 2019 had the care system, and is very important. But the other thing maybe I'm better developed in the 2002 compared to the 2019. I want to make a couple of comments. For instance, I think I agree with several of the comments that were there, and also with Carsten, Lauren and Carsten's editorial for the behavioral ecology and social biology special issue, about the fact that he's missing this intergroup between group component. But I agree with Sari that I will not put it in the same pot of the within group component. So is the social structure? Probably yes, but I would keep it separate and develop it much more. So that's my feeling. And putting together in a way is already indirectly in shaping some of the social interaction and social relationship of within group because of the threat of between group. Okay, that's is in all the sociological models is already there, but we want to make it more explicit. And as Lindelani explained very clearly in her talk, I really enjoyed. There is a lot to do with potentially solitary animal, and there I would like to challenge the specialist on solitary animals to think that really the social unit for these animals is the single individual, or actually is their kind of community around themselves of this kin related sometimes, and the neighbors with whom they have interaction. So the Kappeler's framework needs to define a social unit to begin with. So it may be for some solitary animals, some animals that we consider solitary may not be as solitary as Lindelani explained, but maybe we can then define a different type of social unit in which all these components then will become very much within the framework. But I agree that the framework, Kappeler's framework, allows what Lindelani did, and I think it's beautiful, but we need this between group then, or between solitary animals if we cannot do it. And my last comment is for Michael on the two things that he feel like because I don't really see any confusion between social organization and social structure in the way that Peter Kappeler defines it. Now, there is a lot of confusion still in the papers that I use this framework, even defining well and then messing up during the rest of the paper. So that's but these two examples that Michael mentioned about the kinship, and it depends on what I'm talking about. If the number of kin depends on is on social structure, the social organization, number of kin present in the social unit. If we are talking about how kin patterns shape interactions, it's a social structure. So I think it's very clear. It depends on what we're talking about. And the other part, the dominance hierarchy, is a clear example of social structure. Doesn't have anything to do with social organization. And there is mistaken. People use it, but that's a mistake. Within the framework of Peter Kappeler, social dominance hierarchy is based on social interaction that are related to dominance, from which they develop a dominance relationship, from which comes a dominance hierarchy. It's a perfect example of the Heinz framework of social interaction, social structure, social relationship, social structure, that is the base of Peter Kappeler social social structure component. So I really don't see any ambiguity there, and it seems incredibly clear to me, and it's just that we have to be careful in how to use it. And I finish here.
Great. So I'd like to offer Michael or Lindalani or both to respond if you're interested.
Yeah, I will respond. I think it's very important point that you raised, Filippo, and it's one of the main things that we want to do, to try and have a clear definition of what exactly is a solitary species. And of course, by looking at the social unit, it might help us guide us along the right way. So I'll definitely be looking into refining that much better than we had done in our previous review.
Yeah, just a brief comment on Filippo's comment that for him, the components of social structure and social organization are very clear and separate from each other. I appreciate that. Of course, you can define things in a way that there is a clear separation, but they are functionally strongly connected. And I'm not sure whether there is so much use of defining these components very strictly and narrowly, which is something that apparently you propose, and also Lauren and Carsten propose, to be able to compare different systems with each other. But as I outlined, I'm a bit skeptical about the value and the possibility actually to do that without causing misunderstandings. So I think it is important, and I just repeat what Carsten said in his presentation, that it's important to be clear about how you define things and what you mean by the different terms and concepts. But I think it is perhaps not very realistic to assume that a concept like the one provided in Peter Kappeler's paper of 2019 will completely remove misunderstandings and will sort of help to unify the language and the attempts to explain social systems in all their variation very strongly. I'm a bit skeptical, I must say. I think that is perhaps a bit too ambitious. But anyway, that's my personal opinion.
I'm not that skeptical. Of course, it will never happen that everyone uses the correct terms, especially from the colleagues outside of animal behavior where I experience the problem the most. But I have the feeling over the last 10 years it already improved significantly. The main dichotomy I see is between people working with vertebrates and invertebrates. with social insects, because the social insects people also have already good frameworks and different terminology like subsocial and so on. But I think in our field it is improving. It will not be that always everyone uses it the same way, but I think it got better the last years. And it's a pity Raghavendra is not here, but I think with social insects and vertebrates, that's the main two different fields that use different terms. But as long as they're well defined, it's good. But even in the social insects, people often, unfortunately, they use terms and don't really know what the definition is.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to move on to, oh, Michael, do you want to respond? I see you.
Yeah, just briefly, Carsten. What I see as a general problem is when we use terms from everyday language, like organization and structure, in a very specific way in our own discipline, because that does not allow them to communicate easily with people from other disciplines or with the broad public, because of course the understanding of these words is different. It is mainly the everyday use that causes people to think of certain terms in certain ways. And if we in our field, in our narrow field of studying social behavior, define them in a very specific way, then I think this is really easily causing misunderstandings when we communicate with people from other fields or with non-scientists.
Can I comment briefly?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree on the general public things, and then we have to be flexible. But with the other, especially in other areas, so if we want to do some interdisciplinary thing, actually is the opposite. We have to be incredibly clear or with our terminology, defining in a specific way we use it. I did a lot of work on conflict, interdisciplinary thing, and at the beginning, we didn't understand what we're talking about with the word conflict. But when we start to define it in each field, then we understood each other. So I think we need to actually define it in specifically for our field when we use it in a specific. Otherwise, the problem is we can say very clearly, oh, the social organization is very structured. That is, English-wise, is perfectly correct, the word, but of course creates confusion, is structure, because the next sentence, we are going to talk about that as a social structure. And I saw in papers doing that in our own field. So we do, because we messed up the way you're using the word, we are ended up to mess up the concept within our paper. And so I think it is important instead to define it and stick to that thoroughly. And that's why I think if we all refer to a framework, let's say better couplers, we, at least in a narrow field, we understand each other. When we need to bridge, then we need to say, hey, I'm using this word in this way. And then if it's not clear to the other field, we need to understand each other to us. But to use the term in a loose way, then we really don't understand each other, but we are talking about entities that are completely different.
Yeah, perhaps I can respond to that. My point was not to use terms in the loose way, definitely not. But to avoid using terms that are commonly used in a completely different context in everyday language. That is my point. I would propose that we should try to avoid confusion, and using terms loosely, of course, would not avoid confusion.
Okay, thank you. Very clear.
Thank you both for that discussion. So now I'm going to jump down to Perfect, the student. So please go ahead, Perfect.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to ask the questions. So those who don't know me, my name is Perfect, and I work at the Succulent Karoo Research Station. So I'm also working on the project using camera traps to study the activity budget of the bush karoo rat. So the first question that I had, I was wondering, how can we clearly define and separate components like social organization and social structure? Like, for example, using camera traps data and follow-up question that I have is that, like, for example, this is often like sort of often like suggested that even solitary animals, they still like have social structure, but it's hard to sort of like measure it. And this social structure can be seen like through like space use, for example, like indirect interaction, so to say. And also like you can use like camera traps as like a method to sort of like get this data. But the problem is that, for example, in my data so far, I've seen that I don't have like enough data of these social interactions, for example, which makes it hard to sort of like measure the social structure accurately. So like I wanted to ask, like, how will I know that now I have enough data to sort of describe social structure? How much data does it take to sort of like describe social structure in solitary animals, for example?
So anyone on the panel want to take this, or others have ideas? Maybe Adriana might. Filippo, your hand is raised.
Yeah, I like it. I like the question. Perfect. So let's say depends on what you get from the camera trap data. Okay, the camera trap data are very good, but depends what kind of images you get there. It's just the presence of one individual.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, in the camera trap image that you have
Yes.
one single individual. You have multiple individuals.
I've like monitored multiple lodges, of which like some lodges like occupied by one individual, some lodges were occupied by two or more individuals, of which they were sort of like group living or pair living, so to say.
Mm-hmm. So you have presence or absence of individuals. These are the data you're having, right?
So I have presence, I have absence, and also like these interactions, which include like you'd find that mating, for example, is one of them, which like would be visible from the pictures.
Okay. Now, I mean, let's say mating goes into the mating system, so it's not something that you can use for the social structure, right?
But I mean, like also like with the fact that like you can use space use, for example, as like to sort of like study this social structure, of which like we know that okay, this certain individual like occupy this lodge, of which now it's visible on this camera trap data set from another lodge. That already tells us that okay, it was able to move from that one place to another. So yes.
Yeah, so I feel like this data now in a broader ways. That's why I was trying to ask you more. But they are data of presence and absence fundamentally. You don't see much social interactions between individuals, actually, right? Yeah. So
yes.
They give you, I think, data on association of these individuals. So this data, from my point of view, maybe we agree, goes into social organization. They don't tell you very much about social structure. Now, if you do a specific study on some particular setting where you can see more of the social interaction and be able to demonstrate that what you get into this data on association are basically a good proxy of the actual social interaction to the animals, then you can use the data on social association to come up with a social structure. But otherwise, I feel like you have only data on the social organization and not necessarily on the social structure. That's my take on that. But I'm a bit stricter. So Adriana probably will give you a different view.
Okay.
Yes, please go, Adriana.
Well, for the most part, I agree with you, Filippo. So first of all, you do have data on associations, not interactions. So as Filippo said, you would have basically a different understanding of the system until you get actual data on interactions. But that is not to say that you cannot infer something about the social structure, because indeed a lot of systems and a lot of literature that is out there is based on associations and not interactions. Just look at what we know about whales, they don't necessarily see them interacting. They are just like, together in a space and time. And then we can understand something about how they are interacting in a space without actually interacting with each other. But that's a different aspect. So I often like to just make sure that people have a clear understanding that something that is associated and they are close to each other, it means, from my point of view, there is some tolerance to another individual, but it doesn't mean that they're actually engaging in a social interaction, which requires more than just being tolerant to another individual, right? And as for how many interactions you would need, there's a nice paper out there. It's a theoretical paper, and I think it depends on how you're collecting the data. If it's a focal study where, more like a primatologist will take the data or will collect the data, then I think it's something about 20 interactions for every pair of individuals that you need to have to get something more robust. And yeah, you can just check it out. I think it's from, you can find it under Grace Davies, Meg Crawford, and Damien Farin. Yeah. I don't know. Hopefully that's useful.
Yes. Nice. If you don't mind, I can just ask, like, okay, my last question that I had, which was based on what Isabella was presenting, whereby it's sort of like mentioned that parental care in amphibians is sort of like diverse. So like I wanted to ask, like, for example, like, can differences in parental care like influence other components like mating system or social organization?
Yes, so at the comparative.
Sorry?
I think
Sorry, I was muted. I thought I muted myself. So at the comparative level, what you have is study looking at the directionality of evolution, of whether you have evolution of parental care first or say mating system first, or what type of mating system, right? And that is taken as an indication of potential evolutionary drivers. With our aspect of a social systems, there hasn't been a huge amount of work. I think that is where, for me, the system proposed by Kappeler is helpful because it tries to categorize different aspects already. Social systems are so rich in diversity that having some categories in which to start classifying things is useful, because then you can start looking at what evolves with what in terms of directionality, in terms of association, what is more common with what. So I think most of the work is the relation within the social system with mating system, and particularly with the level of multi-paternity. And so essentially, if you have more monogamous, since you never really have practically complete monogamy, right?
Okay, nice. So you also spoke about the fact that parental care is sort of like evolutionary unstable, even with division of labor. So I wanted to understand also, like, I'm not sure if this question is still within this panel or what, but I wanted to know whether, like, do you have an idea if this okay like in each of these different steps, like for example, like does it also okay like during the egg protection alone, or also like like the transportation and stuff?
Yeah, so in that paper, we look at what behaviors were expressed by the father, what behavior were expressed by the mother, and at what stage. So we did the analysis in two ways. We look at parental care, division of labor within the stages. So you have either, say, at the egg you have male care, but you don't have female care. So you have female care at different stage, or at the same stage, and then it's generally the tadpole juvenile, the behaviors are different. So it's the same stage but different. So we define division of labor where you have different stages or different behavior at the same stage. And what we found is that in amphibians, and then I don't know if that same applies to our system because it hasn't been studied in this way. In amphibians, biparental care is not evolutionary stable. So what that means is that once you have evolution of biparental care, then over a relatively short evolutionary time, one of the two parents loses parental care. So you have either reversal of female care or male care.
Okay, thank you.
But I don't know, in our system, don't know. That would be interesting to do in our species. You need to have amphibians are good like fish because you have all the diversity from no care to biparental, and you have all the possible combination of stages and different type of forms.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Adriana, did you have a question that you wanted to ask independent of your response there?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Kind of going back to something that we already sort of touched, and it's Michael's comment on being like using social organization and structure in an interchangeable way. And I sort of agree with that. I also agree with Filippo. I didn't have any trouble having these two categories as discrete ones until someone asked me to define a social group. And I was doing it very easily. And then someone said, yeah, but then we could do it from the social interactions. And then in social network analysis, there is this method where you identify communities based on the social interactions you have, or if you can build the association index or any index you want. And then from there, these communities are often taken as the social groups, or perhaps that will be equivalent as the social units that Filippo mentioned. So I wonder if part of the problem that we're having is that we are using methods to define our main concepts like social organization and structure. That's one part. And the second, could it be that if we take Hind's framework and we think about all this social complexity and social system from a bottom-up perspective, these social interactions are actually what are defining the other components of the social system? Because there will be some relationships that are specific for the reproductive context, and then we can define all the mating systems, and then we can also define the parental care. And if we use these same relationships or even associations, we can also start identifying the groups. And then probably we could just start describing everything from this perspective. And that was sort of my reflection there. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that. And that goes also for solitary species.
Perhaps if I may briefly answer to that, Adriana, I agree with you that the social interactions, which are sort of summarized in Kappeler's framework under the term social structure, are very central for the not only for the description of the system, but actually for its functionality. So I think this category that apparently also makes it difficult to be separated from other categories for Lauren and Carsten is very central. Therefore, I think one could come up with a different kind of framework where the social interactions are sort of at the center, and they are both influenced by and also influencing the other components that are listed by Kappeler's framework, including mating patterns, including the parental care system and things like that.
Anyone else want to respond?
I wonder why to put the social interactions in the center. Intuitively, it makes sense. From my point of view from now is we put in the center where we know the least. So that makes it difficult to get forward in our discipline because um, we have the least information on it, and the other components also deserve their own right, like the care system or whether the animals live in pairs or not, to be studied independently. But for all the comments, I think what is obvious to me at least is that we still miss a lot of descriptive data on the natural behavior of naturalistic data from the field to approach many of these questions for how animals interact really, whether they have bonds, how these social bonds are expressed in which degree. I think that is one of the main problem at the moment, and we are not at the end of science. Maybe this improves in the next 50 years, but on the other hand, nobody goes out anymore to study wild living animals. It's also complicated. So, but I think we really must also appreciate if we want to study it in a comparative way to get this data, or otherwise we will just have case studies where somebody studies a very complex mouse or very complex cichlid fish or very complex meerkat and go this approach.
Yeah. Thank you for your thoughts on that. If I can ask a second question, Lauren, will it be okay? This is also something that calls my attention. It's the theoretical evolutionary models. How would we use them to sort of complement our framework on social complexity? I think that idea is very interesting, especially because, social relationships, we do know they have some fitness benefits. We just don't know, and it's not very clear how individuals are attaining these benefits, but they are there. So we need to identify these mechanisms. So I wonder how can we incorporate these theoretical models into this framework? And I think this goes mostly for Michael.
Yeah, this is perhaps my major critique, that I think it is not possible to incorporate explanatory evolutionary models into this framework. I think we need to, with each of these different components of social systems, we need to identify the phenomenon that we are interested in and then try to model this respectively. But I think it would be very naive to think of a sort of overarching evolutionary model that explains all the variation in social systems. I think nobody is really aiming for that. So I'm more interested in sort of explanatory models than descriptive models, because I think they may help us to understand, or to at least think about selection mechanisms and the evolution of certain phenomena, and this overarching concept may help to order aspects in our discussion of different systems and different species that we are studying, but it is not helping much in ways of explaining phenomena, interesting evolutionary phenomena.
So I'd like to give Carson a chance to respond, and then I think we should go to Alex, who's next in the queue. Carson, you're muted still.
Unmuted, yes. Just quickly respond to this. It's maybe not a direct response, but a general question. I mean, most of us want to understand evolution, and we have to see, and that's maybe a problem of the framework or not, we want to understand the evolution of traits, and many components in the framework of Kappeler are not really traits where evolution is acting on, like if animals live in groups or not, or pairs. The traits, there's actually something like social cohesion, whether social tolerance, whether they are attracted to each other. But in other aspects, like the care system, like was shown today, it's much more directly the care. Do I carry the tadpoles or do I not carry the tadpoles? So that's another aspect when we want to come from this descriptive framework to evolutionary frameworks. What are actually the traits that evolution and selection is acting on?
Great. Alex, please go ahead. Alex Kasonic.
Yeah, I think I agree with Michael in some of his skeptical comments, but I'd like to ask some specific thing because, of course, we are all interested in explanation, but explanation requires description. So we need to be able to talk about issues with a common language and have a taxonomy of social systems that we can refer to if we are going to start producing explanatory evolutionary ideas in terms of what drives the evolution of this or the other. So the two things cannot be separated. But the one thing that causes me trouble is the one topic that was discussed, which is complexity, and the idea of having an index of complexity. An index is kind of some scalar, some number that can put societies in a ranking from low to high in level of complexity. And suppose we could derive an index of complexity. What would we want it for? We may want it for things like, oh, we are going to do a comparative analysis and correlate, say, the size of the brain or the diet to the complexity of the social system. If we do that, what we should avoid is a circular strategy of defining the index in a way that we think is going to predict the correlation that we want to study. So if we could actually define complexity in an independent way from outside, for example, physicists can say how much entropy there is in a system. We can't do that, but we don't have that. So we intuitively can bias our research by designing an index of complexity that actually correlates with the thing that we would like to use the index for. And then that wouldn't work. So I'm not sure we can do it, but I just wanted to ask people that work in this to comment on this problem. What do we want to measure and why do we want to measure that?
Isabella, please go ahead.
I wouldn't even try to measure complexity, and I would stay away from complexity precisely for the reason you have described. And to me, complexity is very difficult to define and is also making a lot of assumption of what is complex and what isn't complex. And I give you an example of something else is way simpler, like protection. I've seen a paper on comparative study of parental care diversity classified in the degree of protection to the offspring. And to me, it was very questionable because we saw they were putting at middle level of protection, broadening the gut at a much lower level than viviparity. I said, well, why? You know, the egg is inside the stomach, is fully protected by the parent in the same way as is fully protected in the uterus of the mother. And the parent that has the egg in the gut needs to avoid digesting the egg. So there is a lot of physiological complexity around that. So for me, even a simple measure like protection is so difficult without having really strong quantitative data behind it. But I would shy away from trying to define complexity because I wouldn't even know exactly what I want to measure in, say, a social system. Is it more individual? Is more interaction? Is it more variety? I don't know. So I would rather define diversity and then break it down in the way I try to do it in my study is just look at what I see and then let the data tell me what comes out. and then try to interpret it, then say, okay, this might be harder to evolve, easier to evolve, perhaps because it requires more, say, interaction or require more complex brain or whatever, but have it as an explanation rather than try to force my explanation ahead, precisely for the reason I say that you risk to have circularity in the way you define your data, and then the analysis spits out what you wanted in the first place.
Let's go with Marin, because this is the first time you've raised your hand today. So please go ahead. Uh-oh. I'll come back to you. um, go Filippo, please.
Okay, sorry that it's always me, and I forgot early on to say that I'm Filippo Relli from Universidad Veracruzana in Mexico. And then you can delete my question mark afterwards because I was planning to say what I'm going to say now. So then I think Alex prompted me for answering, and what Isabella said fits very nicely as well. So I agree that it's very difficult to define complexity, and sometimes there is this circle of things, and is it really needed? But I'm adding one extra layer of doubting, and I go back to Michael's example of the Starling, moving. It seems rather complex, but it's complex in which way and so on and so forth. The definition is there, is complex. We have big things about what we see as complex and what the animal inside the group see as complex. And I think that's a fundamental for most of the questions we want to answer. We messed up all the time. So the Starling, is a pretty complex, and it's fantastic to explain how this complexity of the Starling movement comes about. But for the Starling itself, it has to follow a very, very simple rule. And so it's not complex whatsoever for the Starling itself, okay, for the single Starling. And that's, I think, what is important to do. And so incredible social complex system, and now in broad ways, they use social system or with the caste system and so on, it's pretty complex. But for a single bee or the single ant is much less complex than a system in which there are no castes and need to deal with a variety of type of relationship that they have, because every single they have a different relation with every single individual. So I think if we take the individual perspective, and then I think it's easier to quantify the complexity if we want to, and then we can correlate with something. Going back to Alex, if we define complexity with group size, and then we correlate it with group size, of course, doesn't make any sense. But if we defining from the individual point of view what the individual has to deal with, and then we correlate it with cognitive abilities or certain cognitive abilities, I think that is a possible thing. So it depends really what we want to measure with to have a different type of measure of social complexity, because otherwise I agree with Alex and Isabella, we just turn around and it's not very useful.
Thanks, Filippo. Checking in on Marin. No. Carsten, please go ahead.
Yeah, I have two comments to this discussion. First, complexity in our field is used in two ways, and to study it or to use it as an argument. And I'm mainly allergic against people using it as an argument, like in the title. I'm studying kin selection in the highly socially complex this and that, or like a proposal that was submitted today by our co-author. We study ultrasound communication that is highly complex in the striped mice, and using this complex without that it's measurable. Also, just to show this is so important that we have to study it. And I think most study species that we have seen here and defined deserve to be studied and to be understood. And there's not one species more complex than the other per se. And then I agree with Isabella that when you do study it, you need good definitions, and the definition maybe should avoid the term complex and instead state clearly what variation, what trait and variation is trait that you're studying. For example, I didn't like the definition that Michael brought in his talk that he used, that complexity is from the social interactions only within species living in groups, because this would mean solitary species are not complex at all. And I have to say, when I compare what I see, what in the Lani season, the solitary bush curates, how they have to deal with their life, with what I, as a PhD student, saw in the helpers of the callitrichid monkeys, I have the feeling, the emotional feeling, that the life of the bush curates is much more complex than for being a helper in a group. And then you don't have to make many decisions. I mean, you just follow the group, and that's why I would not use the term complex. But then, like Isabella said, define clearly, I study this trait and the variation in it, and one can avoid this term. But it seems not only referees, but especially the public loves the term complex in any writing.
Okay, Maren, any update? Hey, great.
My name is Maren Hook. In my former life, I used to be working with primates, and I have been in the department of Peter Kappeler, so I grew up with a theory. I wanted to talk about the complex, and I may have missed just the last couple of people speaking what they said about it. It would be nice if we had a measure of complexity, but I think if we ever get it, which I'm not sure we would be able to, but if we ever get it, I'm sure there would be a phase where we do it completely wrong, because we focus on a little bit what has been said before, but we would probably focus on those mammals, primates with fission fusion systems or several hierarchical levels, and we would completely ignore the complexity within, for example, solitary species. I have been working on primates, but I have been, as you probably saw, I've been also very interested in the social life of cats. And it's much less obvious and therefore much less easy to measure. And so I'm pretty sure we would get it wrong in the beginning to really, well, there are probably several layers of complexity in this area, but not complex in the other area, but very complex perhaps in very subtle cues. If you compare cats to dogs, for example, they are equally complex, but with dogs as a human, you see it immediately. With a cat, you probably don't see it immediately. So there are very many levels and different kinds of animals, and depending on what is our background, what we are studying, we may see it or completely miss it. And I think with solitary animals, it's much more dangerous that we miss out the complexity and have a concept that is very anthropocentric in a way. Yeah.
Nice. I just want to inform everyone it is 1 o'clock. This discussion has been amazing. There are several more comments, questions, hands up. So I'll continue it. But if people have to drop off, I totally understand. I want to, before I think I see 2 more in the queue and then 2 hands raised. I might go to the newest question in the queue, within the queue, Anna Marie.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Anna Marie. I'm at the Institute of Ecology and Biodiversity in Chile. I was kind of like interested by what Adriana was saying about thinking about how we define a social group or potentially like the social unit. And it is often based on social, like on the associations. So I'm thinking just of like with the species I've been working with, they're all semi-fossorial. So we kind of like look at, okay, how often do they share a sleeping burrow together? And can we then like, is an association still part of like an interaction or like part of the social structure? Or do we then, these associations are then part of the social organization? It's kind of like, it is so species specific too on how we define a social unit. So it is complex in the overall. But yeah, I'm kind of like curious how everyone is thinking about it.
I think Adriana dropped off is she still there? There you are. You had to leave soon.
I do have to leave, yeah. But I mean, Mari, I hear you, and that's something I've been also thinking about, like to what extent associations are or not part of the structure. But as I mentioned before, we also use it, we have been using it traditionally to sort of start understanding part of the social structure, because as Karsten said, we do not have enough data on interactions, and it's really hard for a lot of species to actually get that type of data. Primatologists might be really, really lucky because they often describe everything based on interactions, and it's very diverse and it's very rich. But for us, like working with rodents, like how do we think about grooming? What is that exactly? What that means in terms of like this system? Do we just go with associations because we see them together and just foraging in the same patch? Will that mean something for the rodent? Might not mean the same thing for a primate because they are not very close together. So I think it's something to sort of deep a little bit, just think a little bit more about it, maybe come up with a different, way to think and come up with, definitions on, okay, associations are part of this, and then we move it away. Or maybe we do, as Michael said, well, this is not discrete. This is somehow continuous. And then when do we move from one place to another? So I don't have a clear answer to this, but I don't think there is one so far.
I don't think so either. Thanks.
Yeah, but yeah, great. Sorry, I've got to go. So great to see everyone. I'll see you next week.
Thank you, Adriana. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go with Sari, because she's been in the queue for a while. And then Sandra, you put your hand down, I assume. Okay, and then we'll end with Michael, and then I'll stop the live stream. So go ahead, Sari, please.
My question was kind of more towards the special issue that is planned. You presented to us like the ideas of authors that already are invited with topics, but particularly like there were the topics on like the care system and the kind of the four kind of components, right? That what are the ideas behind that each of these authors will kind of decompose each component, go into like the diversity of each component? That's one question. And then the other one, there was some kind of invitation for other authors to contribute, like with another. What are you looking for in these kind of?
So I'll let Carson go first. Oh, no, he doesn't.
I mean, I
Sorry,
can
caught him
first
off guard.
say,
You want
I
to go?
mean, the papers on the four components, it's not theoretical papers where people go into the different subcategories of it, but there the aim is, from my understanding, that they show how in some comparative studies to understand social organization or understand aspects of the social structure and so on, how the framework has helped to come to a better understanding. That's, in our case, for example, it's mainly by coming to clear definitions. What papers are we looking for? We're looking for papers that really use Kappeler's framework and show its benefits and or its limitations. So if you have an idea where you can show how the framework has helped to come to a better understanding, or maybe a theoretical paper where you show where there are limitations that hinder understanding because something is missing or should be different, and this is something we would be interested in. Also, to emphasize, we're not interested in reading 20 pages of stuff that is correct but doesn't come to the point, but we will really also appreciate it if people come to the point for the readership to get something out and use in the future.
And from my perspective, sorry, I think, we've been tasked by the editor to, that if it doesn't address Kappeler's framework in some way, we can, say, I'm sorry, it's not appropriate for what we're looking for. I agree with what Carson said. And coming specifically to your earlier comment about intergroup relations, when you said that, I wrote that down as an exciting idea that this is the great thing about those fine discussions. We didn't think of that, and so that's a potential contribution that would it'd be a nice contribution to the overall project.
So you would be interested to, I would actually suggest that the social structure component is subdivided into two, and that one focuses on intra-group and another on intergroup. And that is part of like, it would be then 5 main things, right? And then all the others.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, and again, from my perspective, you're taking like what Kappeler's framework is, and and expanding it, or critically thinking about it in that context. And I think that's an appropriate and interesting extension from his paper.
All right.
Carsten?
I will write you guys with it in an email so that we can discuss this further.
Yes, would be interesting. I mean, we mentioned this quickly in the introductory paper, still, I believe. And then you can think about whether you want to write something like a short opinion piece, or whether you have some empirical studies to emphasize there.
Thank you.
Michael, you've had your hand up for a while, so we'll end with you today.
Just as a late response to Alex's comment on social complexity and the use of this as a sort of quantitative measure, I think we should be aware that this is rather a qualitative term, and we should leave it like that. I think it is probably unrealistic to come up with something sensible that would allow us to compare different systems or different components of systems by a measure, a metric that somehow we think describes social complexity quantitatively. But I think social complexity is an interesting idea still, even if it's not quantifiable so easily. And for me, social complexity is, in my understanding, is mainly based on the interactions that animals have. So it is based within the category of social structure in Kappeler's framework, because I think it is an interesting question which information individuals have to obtain and to consider when making decisions in the social context. Yeah, so I think for me, social complexity always has to do something with the interaction structure of individuals, and I would really base this on the individual perspective, as Filippo also suggested.
Can I make a quick comment on that?
Yes, please, Alex.
Yeah, I agree of the enormous difficulty, but on the other hand, I feel we can't completely forget about it, because you have very influential ideas like the social brain hypothesis that tell us that actually it is social complexity that drives the evolution of cognitive complexity and of the brain. And some people could see the other way around. If you have a very complex and developed brain, then you can have a complex society because you can remember the interactions of everybody with everybody else. So it is a useful idea to work, but it remains qualitative, and perhaps one route to one day have a quantitative index is to think, if you were to generate robots that reproduce that kind of society or some artificial agent, so how many lines of code, how many instructions would you have to give to actually reproduce a social system like that? Do you have to include sensitivity to the relation of people you don't know, but that know someone else who knows someone else? Or is it enough to include your direct network of relationships? So it's not completely hopeless. It's enormously difficult, and I would use it with great caution at defining it, but I don't think it should be completely abandoned, because it is fertile to talk about some issues of comparison. We are not going to solve it. It was just a comment on that nature.
Well, thank you, Alex, and I think I'll stop it there because it's 10 after 1. I want to again thank the panel. This was, for me, it was an amazing discussion, and everyone who participated as well. I learned a lot today, and I enjoyed it immensely. And just a quick announcement about next week. I'll be hosting again. My colleague Hope Klug, who studies mating systems and parental care in fish, will be speaking. And with that, I'm going to stop the stream, and people are